Let Phase 4 begin. So Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings tells the story of a martial arts master who has to confront his past, his father, and the Ten Rings organization. Alright guys, we've got another MCU movie upon us, and Black Widow, technically I guess the start of Phase 4, but really this movie feels like the start of Phase 4, so for all intents and purposes, we're also starting a whole new generation of Marvel movies. Ever since Endgame, it really has felt like the MCU has kind of come to a natural conclusion, and while we've had the pandemic slowing a lot of things down, while we've had a lot of Marvel shows come out that certainly aren't like big screen quality stuff, but are very interesting story directions, it's felt a little bit uneasy about where the Marvel Cinematic Universe is going to be going in the future. So admittedly, I really wasn't hyping this movie all that much. I really wasn't looking forward to it. I'm not really big into martial arts movies. Of course, I like some good action, I like some good hand-to-hand combat, but I've never really grown up watching Jackie Chan films or Jet Li movies or anything like that. I haven't even seen the Raid movies yet. I know, shoot me. Not really my thing. So that paired with the fact that Marvel has kind of been, up in the air and I'm a little bit fatigued by it, had absolutely no expectations walking into Shang-Chi. So is Shang-Chi a movie that actually went above my expectations and really excites me for the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Or am I still kind of in that limbo phase of, is the Marvel Cinematic Universe already past its prime? Starting off with the positives, the main thing for this one for me is that it has the best action of any of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films. Certainly when you're talking about hand-to-hand combat. Of course, with Avengers and stuff, you're getting a lot more CG spectacle, a lot more big, epic action. This is more hand-to-hand, a little bit more small-scale combat for the most part. There's also that MCU stuff as well. But all of the hand-to-hand combat here, all the fight choreography, all of the different variations of fight choreography, I thought was awesome. When this movie was kicking ass, it was kicking major ass. And there's a lot of variety to the fights as well. Like, we've all seen aspects of the whole bus fight in the trailer. I think they released a big extended clip of it as well that I did not watch, but that's kind of like your hand-to-hand, like John Wick slash, like recently Nobody type fight scenes where it's all close quarters. There's a lot of flipping around and doing a lot of Jackie Chan type moves where he's going in between bars and using the environment to his advantage in the fight. Then you get a little bit more mystical fights where people are floating around, kind of like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where there's a lot of mysticism and a lot of fantastical elements to the fights. And then of course, because this is a Marvel film, we do get the big, giant, epic spectacle fights where you've got CGI monsters and like a kaiju style battle and stuff like that. So as far as the action sequences, a lot of variety on top of them being top-notch quality. And I gotta admit, for somebody that really isn't into Japanese culture, Chinese culture, martial arts, all of that fantastical elements with dragons and all of that, I've never really been into that stuff, and I probably never will. That part of this movie was the most interesting part to me. It was, long as they were focusing on the lore of this world and how like the martial arts powers of Shang-Chi as well as his father the Mandarin kind of compare and contrast, and this other world that they have to get into by the middle, second act, third act, all of that, whenever they're kind of exploring the Asian culture in this movie, I was totally drawn in. This, more than most movies of this type, really sucked me in and made me want to learn more. Like, I would really want to see this world itself expanded in a Shang-Chi 2, Shang-Chi 3. Obviously, he's going to join the greater MCU at some point, but I'm really interested in his world. The villain in this movie is really interesting and a really effective, very intriguing villain that is complicated to where, he's not necessarily this full-blown evil guy that just wants world domination and I want to kill everyone. You understand his motivations. You understand, why he was a bad guy. He's got a little bit of a redemptive angle to him, and then you understand why he becomes the antagonist again by the end of the film, and him and Shang-Chi have to come to fisticuffs, and you totally understand from his perspective why he feels like he's doing the right thing. And the best villains are always the ones that feel like they're not really villains, that feel like they're in the right, everybody's just kind of misunderstanding them. And for Marvel especially, villains is kind of a thing that they're a little bit spotty on. So that was nice to see a villain that I actually was intrigued by. And in a lot of ways, the plot of this movie and the message of this movie is kind of half hinged on him as well as your protagonist. So he kind of shares the importance with the titular character of Shang-Chi here.
Is this what you wanted?
Oh, and it goes without saying that since we're actually going to see the real Mandarin in this movie without getting too far into spoilers, those of you that have been bitching and crying and pissing and moaning for a decade now about Iron Man 3, well, I think things are fixed now, aren't they? Moving on to the mixed, the main one for me, strangely enough, is all of the MCU elements that have to come into this movie. Now, obviously, this is an MCU movie. It can't be something totally separate. That's not how Marvel works. Everything has to tie back into the greater universe in certain aspects. Everything has to set up the next 10 movies in certain ways. So you walk into a Marvel movie knowing that. But strangely, where I walked into this thinking that I wasn't really going to care for the fantastical elements in the Japanese culture and the Chinese culture and the martial arts stuff and all of that doesn't really resonate with me personally, and I was probably going to like all the Marvel cinematic superhero epic universe shit more. It kind of was the opposite. The parts that I was totally intrigued by was when this movie was not being a Marvel movie, when it was just being a martial arts film. And as soon as it had to stomp on the brakes and remind us that we were in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it kind of took me out of the movie every single time. I mean, you'd be in this badass world and then all of a sudden the Abomination shows up for 3 seconds. And you're like, oh yeah, I forgot this is a Marvel movie. And then we're back into that world and all of a sudden they're doing their little Marvel quippy shit, which I'm gonna talk more about. Then I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah, it's an MCU movie. And then you get towards the end and then we're starting to figure out how this is going to play into the further Marvel Cinematic Universe and how this might be setting up future events. And again, I just kind of left like, I don't even really care about that. I want to see more of this world. So it's weird. I don't know if everybody's going to feel that way for me, or same way as me. I don't know if that was just me on an island, but I loved Shang-Chi when it was just being its own thing, when it was tying itself back into the MCU and checking all those MCU boxes. Those were my least favorite parts of the movie. But at the same time, why it's in the mixed, I mean, you have to have that. I mean, you couldn't have Shang-Chi be in its own world and not tie back into the MCU or not feel like an MCU film, because at this point, that's just not possible in the MCU. I mean, DC has done a good job at kind of building out a universe to where things can feel separate, things can feel part of the universe, and you don't really raise your eyebrows too much. The MCU has been so templated at this point that if the movie didn't have all those elements, it would probably piss off a lot more people than it appeased. Now moving into the negatives, the main one, the humor in this movie is terrible. There was not one single moment that genuinely made me laugh. Now, I'm a hard audience when it comes to humor. I have a very specific type of humor. I have a very specific sense of humor. And the goofy, quippy, PG-13 riffing that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has crammed down my throat for the better part of a decade, it works more times than it doesn't, but when it doesn't, it really doesn't. And this movie was just flat from beginning to end on the humor front. And part of that might be because I just don't really vibe with Awkwafina's style of humor. Obviously, a lot of people do, so again, might be on an island with that one, but I would say 80% of the humor in this movie, and that might be generous, is coming from her character specifically. And it just never really worked for me. And it was to the point where, like a lot of other Marvel films have had this problem, the big action spectacle or a tense scene or even a dramatic scene is always undercut by a stupid joke. Every single time. A lot of people had this problem with Thor Ragnarok, to where something really deep, something really resonant and important is going on and you're supposed to feel a certain way, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe just immediately cuts to a goofy joke. And it just kind of got tiresome for me, to where every single time they cut back to her character riffing on the situation, I was like, move on, please. Next.
You got this.
Thank you.
Another big problem that I had with this, and again, I'm not going to get too specific plot-wise, but essentially the first act of the movie is the Mandarin trying to get this pendant from Shang-Chi and his sister in two separate events. So the Ten Rings people just randomly ambush these two characters. You know, if it wasn't a Marvel movie, people would be dying left and right with the level of extreme this situation gets to. And then you find out the motivation from the Mandarin of why he's trying to get these 2 pendants. And it just really doesn't make sense of why they took that approach in the first act aside from needing action sequences. It's like, dude, if that's all you wanted it for, why the fuck didn't you just like call me? Like I could have sent you the goddamn pendant. And finally, I felt like the movie was a little bit too long. Now, maybe that's because the humor wasn't really working for me, so I would get into the film and then I would kind of come out of it, and I would get into it and come out of it, and so that kind of exhausted me by about the 2-hour mark. This is about 2 hours and 12 minutes, and you have to acknowledge that full runtime. You can't take off points for the credits because, as we all know, Marvel Cinematic Universe films, you gotta stay for the mid-credit, you gotta stay for the post-credit. I think this movie would have been a little bit better at a hard 2 hours, maybe even an hour and 50 minutes. I don't really know specifically what they can cut because there was a lot that they had to introduce and explore in this movie, but I did find myself in the last 15 minutes or so just feeling like the movie was dragging a bit. There was 2 or 3 different moments where it felt like the movie was coming to a nice, easy conclusion to where it's like, okay, this feels like this should be the end of the movie, and then it kept going. And then it felt like it was gonna end, and then it kept going. And that even if you're not bored, which I wasn't, it exhausts you a little bit by the end. But overall, guys, I actually surprisingly enjoyed this movie. I went in with no expectations. I walked out pretty entertained. I'm really interested in this character. I'm really interested in this world. Still a little bit rocky on the future of the MCU, but nonetheless, we'll see where things go from here. Spider-Man Far From Home, I'm certainly hyped as fuck for that movie, so we'll see how things go. But if you're a martial arts fan, or if you're an MCU fan, I think you will really enjoy this movie. And if you're a fan of both, this might be one of your favorite Marvel films. So if you're a fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and you want to see how they were going to bring Shang-Chi into this film universe, definitely check out this origin movie. It's one of the better origins in Marvel, and it was a damn good martial arts film. Just felt like they dropped the ball a lot on the humor, and the MCU stuff really didn't interest me a whole lot in this one. So we'll see where you guys end up, but overall, if you're a fan of this kind of thing, definitely check it out in theaters. And when it comes out on video, go out and buy it. So what did you guys think of Shang-Chi? Was this up your alley? Was this something that you were really waiting for? You're just a martial arts fanatic? Or were you like me and that's really not your thing? How did you feel about it? Did you really love the martial arts and the fantastical elements and all the fighting like I did? Or did this just continue to not really be your thing? Let me know your thoughts down below and where the MCU is headed from here. Do you feel like it's healthy, or do you feel like the best days are behind us? Let's talk about it down in the comments section. Please like and share this video. Hit that subscribe button if you are not already a subscriber. I'm gonna be doing a Hellraiser review series here very soon if you're a horror fan. I'm also gonna be doing an Exorcist review series very soon. So if you guys are horror fans, absolutely hit that subscribe button. But if you're not, I'll definitely be talking about more Marvel films and more blockbusters as they come out, provided that they don't get delayed. So cross your fingers on that one. Thank you guys for watching as always, and please remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.